Hey everyone, it's me, HawkeyeG, and today we're here with another army composition guide. This guide is for the Wood Elves, and I am creating this assuming you have all the DLC, though it should still be useful to you to give you some general ideas, even if you don't have all the DLC. I do have a couple of small things to discuss first, but then I'll be going through early game compositions, mid game compositions, and late game army compositions that I think you should consider. I'll explain what you're supposed to do and when you would use them if that applies. I do also want to say that if you are enjoying these videos and you want to see me make more, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Every like and every subscription that I get really helps me out and it motivates me a lot to keep making these videos. So thanks for all of you out there that have been doing that so far. With that being said, there are a couple little things first, like I said, then we'll get to the compositions. So, the first thing that I want to touch on is how I'm going to be talking about like what defines the early game and mid game for the Wood Elves, because their settlement building does not level up. It doesn't require growth points to level up, right? You use those growth points instead to level up all of your buildings except for your military recruitment buildings, right? So that means as long as you have the money, you can upgrade your capital as soon as it's ready. So it's kind of a different balance, right? It's not about chasing growth to get your settlement up. It's more about just the time that it takes to get your settlement up, but also how you balance your economy, because of course your economic buildings do require those growth points. So even if you could create, certain level units, you might just not be able to afford it. You do, of course, have different building slot limitations to consider as well, and it works a little differently, right? We've got like a 9 slot with the settlement building. At level 1 you have 3 construction slots available. You gain another 2 at level 2, but then you only gain like 1 additional slot at tier 3, and then you gain 2 and then 1. Okay, so for the sake of this guide, I'm going to be considering early game mostly from the perspective of the 5 slots, right? Because when you put this 6 slot in, I think there's just like you can't account for all the situations, and having this 1 extra building slot, you can go with like so many independent things that I don't think it's worth trying to build compositions. You'll see what I mean when I get into it, but essentially my point is I'm going to be talking about early game assuming that you have access to only 5 total buildings, and so we'll talk about that more when we get there. And then for like what I consider mid-game, I usually end up talking about tier 4 units for armies in mid-game, where I start breaking into that. So we are going to consider you to have more construction slots available to you at that time. But yeah, like I said, it's just a little bit different how the Wood Elf stuff works. So what you're going to see from these compositions and how they work is going to depend more on the buildings that I would think that you should prioritize at that stage in order to achieve certain compositions, right? So hopefully that makes sense. With that being said, there's one other topic that I want to touch on, and that is actually the Waywatchers unit, okay? And this section is just going to be Waywatchers, ? I talk about this in my campaign strategy guide for the Sisters of Twilight as well, but the question is always the same when considering high-tier army units. Is the upgrade worth it? Okay, Waywatchers are certainly better than Glade Guard overall. If we just go here real quick and we bring up like one of these, compare it to some Waywatchers. I mean, you can see, right? Look at that. Across the board, their stats are better. Their health is lower, but that kind of gives you a hint as to what I'm going to talk about, right? So first thing to note is they cost twice as much, right? This upkeep is slightly reduced here, but you can see, right, these have a base. The Waywatchers literally cost twice as much. Now they have great stats, right? One of the big advantages they have is that they have the Master Ambusher, right? So they can fire in all directions. It seems that Glade Guard can still fire while moving forward, but they can't fire backwards, or they can't fire the opposite direction that they're moving, right? And so they have much better stats, both like range, missile damage. Even their melee stats are a little better. They have the 360 firing degree, but they cost twice as much. Now, the other thing is you can get armor piercing on regular Glade Guard, right? Like, that's a big advantage that the Waywatchers have. But Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts also have armor piercing missile damage, right? The other thing to look at is a unit of Glade Guard on large unit scale, 60 units, but Waywatchers only have 45. So, sure, they do more damage, right? But do they do more damage per model, but is that per model enough to make a big enough difference for the reduced total number of models, right? So it's just something to consider with the limited economy that you have as the Wood Elves. Are you willing to put double the cost into it for the Waywatchers? I mean, I do think in the end game you might as well be going with the strongest units you can get, but, you know, trying to push towards Waywatchers even early on or mixing them into your compositions is just something to consider. That, and especially just because the Wood Elf archers in general are so powerful. Even your Glade Guard is going to outperform pretty much anything other than like Shades or Sisters of Avalorn, right? So do you even really need the highest tier archers if their performance isn't going to be that much better for such an increase in cost with the Wood Elves limited economy? So that's just a question I want people to consider. You kind of have to make the decision for yourself. You probably have to, you know, play with the units yourself and test them out. You'll see it kind of reflected in some of the compositions here, so it's just something I wanted to touch on. With that being said, let's jump into some of the compositions here. I've loaded up what I have set as what I'd consider early game armies for the Wood Elves. So the first one, you've already seen it, right? Pretty obvious, okay? Glade Guard spam. I already said it. Wood Elf archers are very strong, right? And these Glade Guards are just gonna, they're so good, and they're gonna outperform a majority of other archer units in the game. They have enough speed to run away from a lot of enemies. They just do so much damage. Like, this is simple, right? Checkerboard formation with archers, and you just do dominant damage. Now, I talked about the 5 building limit for early game that I'm gonna try to impose. So you've got the archer building. You've got the armory, because that allows you to have the Starfire Shafts Glade Guard as well. So you can kind of have both here, right? The Hagbane tips for magic damage and the poison effect, and you can have the armor piercing, right? So you have magic damage, physical damage, you have armor piercing, you have poison. It's incredible, right? It's very strong for early game. So you would have these 2 buildings, and then you would be able to put all 3 economy buildings in there, right? And this is my point about that 6th building. The 6th building, you could then either take Branch Wraiths or the Spell Singer, you know, whether you want a mage or you want the casualty replenishment hero, right? So that's the idea behind this army. The next army is just melee unit, like melee and missile infantry spam, okay? This one, again, pretty self-evident, right? So we would have the infantry building, the ranged building, and the forge again. And then we would probably take the growth and public order economy buildings, because they're still going to make you a decent bit of money, right? There's your 5 building limit. Now again, the 6th building could be Branch Wraiths, casualty replenishment, could be Spell Singers, magic, could be Grapevines for public order, right? Or for income. So that's, like I said, that's why I don't want to try to decide on the 6th building. But so you can see here, right, as a result, we end up getting a bunch of archers, right? We got a nice mix of Glade Guard. We've got Eternal Guards with the shields for line holding, and then we have the Blade Singers to get in there and do some damage. I kind of assume you would take the Branch Wraith hero for the casualty replenishment here, and then you can also put a Glade Captain in. You know, as you can see, I mean, I still have this army set up, assuming you eventually make it to tier 3. You have the Forge, and you put the Blade Singers in the army, right? But really, this can be any of the, like, damage dealing melee infantry. Okay, the next one, Forest Spirits, Glade Guard, and flying units, right? So this would assume then that you get the ranged building, the Forest Spirit building, and the flying building. You do not get the armory, but you get the hunting and the crafting building, right? And so this one, you know, I feel like Dryads and Treekin underperform in my experience, but if we're going off of their stat line, like this is what you want, right? These Dryads have high armor and they have great physical resistance. They don't have shields, so they will suffer from ranged attacks, especially armor piercing range. But comparing that to something like the Eternal Guard, right? They have more physical resistance and they have more armor. They just don't have the shields. So Dryads should be relatively survivable, even though they're a damage dealer. You got a couple of Treekin for line holding. You got Eagles for flying units for flanking. You have the Glade Guard. Hawk Riders, definitely a questionable pick. I know I'm on the Sisters of Twilight. I know they have the ability, and so it might be worth it in this faction. I kind of just put them in there because if we're going to look at, if we're going to seriously say, hey, let's put this flying building in, a couple of Hawk Riders might help. the point is to get an idea of what your composition might look like if you went with an army like this, right? 4 spirit, archer, and flying units. Are the Hawk Riders good or not? I don't really think they're that great, but they could serve a purpose in this army composition, okay? The next early game composition is melee unit, missile unit, and cavalry. Pretty standard. Again, you can see that this kind of works under the assumption that we would not have the forge building. So you've got some like different melee units, kind of for line holding. Not like the point of this army isn't really to do the standard like archer, spearman, like line holding, right? You've got, I mean, the spears should still have your anti-large. These should be able to kind of hold units in place, but the whole point is you kind of want to get your cavalry around the side and start flanking. Now, I didn't put Wild Riders in here because in order to get Wild Riders with shields, you would need the armory building. So instead, we just kind of have a couple of regular Glade Riders and then Glade Riders with spears. You're definitely going to want to advance them to Wild Riders at some point. You might even want to do some Eternal Guard with spears, but just to give you an idea, right? Don't forget that even though you're playing the Wood Elves, you can still do your classic, like, infantry, archer, cavalry composition, right? And honestly, this one might be a little bit heavy on the archers and a little bit light on the melee infantry. Even might be a little bit heavy on the cavalry, so you might have to rebalance it or tweak it a little bit. But you'll have to play around with it and see what works. The last composition is melee, missile, and flying. Okay, again, you can see that we're missing the forge here because we have melee, missile, and flying, assuming the 2 economic buildings, right? But so you won't have shields on your Eternal Guard, but they've still got good armor. They still have a bit of physical resistance and missile resistance. You've got some damage dealing melee infantry. You've got a good spread of archers still, even without, all the armor, even without the armor piercing variant. These are still going to do great damage. They have great stats. And then you've got the Great Eagle, very versatile unit, going to achieve a lot of good flanks, really capable of a variety of roles. And so you've kind of got, right, this instead of going with the cavalry route where these cavalry are kind of going to be a little soft. It depends on if you like cavalry. Like cavalry and flying units each have their own weaknesses, so you kind of have to choose for yourself here. But I think that this army can be very powerful, right? Obviously, the archer spam is going to be easy to control, and this is very strong. But even doing like your mix of melee and missile infantry is going to be strong as well. So those are some ideas that I have for what your early game compositions for the Wood Elves could be in the campaign that you should consider. Should pretty much work for any Wood Elf faction. Some of these are going to work better than others, whether it's more Forest Spirit heavy or more Elf heavy. But with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the mid-game army compositions. Alright, so just a quick note to touch on, of course, before we talk about the mid-game armies. Just a reminder that I'm talking about this kind of in terms of the assumption that we're on tier 4, right? You're going to have 8 construction slots, and I'm probably going to assume that 1, 2, 3 of them are taken up by your economy, right? So we're essentially going to have 4 buildings to work with for military now, where your 5th building might be, a special building for that province, or it might be the defensive building, or it might just be like the spell singers, right? Like a hero production building. So we'll sneak that in. But I kind of try to work with 4 separate military buildings at this stage of the campaign and assume tier 4, okay? First army, pretty obvious. You probably guess it. Full set of heroes and Waywatcher spam. I know I talked about whether I think Waywatchers are worth it or not, but if you go with something like this is, again, a very simple army to manage. It's going to be very powerful, has a lot of advantages over your enemy, incredible range and good enough speed. It's, of course, going to be vulnerable to cavalry. That's hopefully why you have the heroes in the army, to be able to bog them down or tie them up. You might have some problems dealing with artillery. But yeah, just something like this is just so simple to manage and so easy to navigate, and it's going to be very strong, right? And because the only thing you need for this, is just the ranged building. You don't even need a forge. You can have all the economy buildings, and you can get 1, 2, 3 hero buildings, right? And then still have room for whatever else you want. Maybe the garrison for upkeep reduction and ammunition bonuses, what have you, right? The next composition is another infantry, missile, and cavalry mix, right? And with this one, you would, with the 4 buildings that we would talk about, right, you can see that we're going to have the forge, right? So we have infantry, missile, and cavalry in this army, and then the forge. That means that you have room for 1 hero. So again, either the mage or the branch wraith for replenishment. Okay, and so you can see how this one works out. I like to take the Eternal Guard even pretty deep into mid game. I do like the classic like spearmen, archers, and then some bolt throwers or something. You can tell I'm a high elf player. But yeah, shielded spearmen are a great unit. They're tough to beat. They're definitely going to start taking a lot of damage from the kinds of enemy units you'll be facing in the mid game. Eternal Guard will somewhat struggle to hold the line at this phase of the game, but that's all you really need them to do is hold. Like, they're not there to deal damage. They're not even really there to survive. They're easily replaceable, right? They're going to intercept a lot of the damage. Meanwhile, your archers are going to sit behind them and have the range. You can see I kind of have a blend of archers here. I like to do this because then it solves me, prevents you from having to answer the question, well, which type of archer is best? Well, if you just put one of every type, you never have to figure that out. But so we can have armor piercing from the Waywatchers. We can have magic damage and the high, like, extra damage from the Swift Shiver. Is that what it is? Swift Shiver shards? Yeah. Say that 5 times fast. They fire double projectiles. They have magic damage. Then even just the basic Deepwood Scouts, maybe a little bit cheaper, and just to kind of have that base damage. Now, since we're reaching tier 4 here, we can put the Wild Riders with shields in, right? So you have Spearmen for line holding, Archers for damage on the like income and outcome, and then you have Cavalry for the hammer and anvil style, right? Getting the flanks off, either attacking their ranged units or preferably rear-charging their infantry. You also have a couple of Sisters of Thorn. You gotta remember that these are support units. I think that Sisters of Thorn, even in my own playthroughs, it's a unit that I don't use enough. I don't necessarily love cavalry all the time in this game, and at this point with that bug, it's in pretty dire straits. But Sisters of Thorn are like ranged cavalry, right? Kind of weird, so this is like skirmish cavalry. But the key here is that they have 2 pretty powerful spells, right? And so this is a support unit, right? You're not really supposed to dive this into melee combat heavily all the time, but just having a couple of these to float around is nice. So this is the kind of composition you can get if you're looking for like melee infantry, missile infantry, and cavalry, right? The next composition we have here, we start introducing some forest spirits again. So we have treekin, infantry, and cavalry, right? So this is going to be like a very melee, like contact-heavy army, okay? You've got the treekin, which, again, I personally find them to underperform, but if we're just looking at their stat lines, right, these have great armor, they have good missile and physical resistance, their speed isn't bad, but it's not great, but they have like good defensive. This is supposed to be a defensive unit. You put your treekin out there first to start absorbing and tar pitting the units. You then send in your variety of infantry. We've got armor piercing anti-infantry. We've got armor piercing standard, which does have the strange little like anti-large bonus if they're in the forest. And then you've got Wild Riders with shields, right? So with this kind of composition, right, use the treekin to bog them down, and then you rush them with all sorts of different creatures here. You also should have enough buildings to get all of the different hero types in here that you'd like. You can see I even have the Waystalker hero here because you would have room for that if we look at this, right? You'd have infantry and cavalry and tree spirit. This gives you the hero. That's only 3 buildings. You can grab the forge, and you can still... Can you still get the... Well, maybe that's not correct, but anyway. I'm sure you'll be able to get some kind of Waywatcher at this point. A lot of the times I leave these out of the army because they have all of these... obviously this one was in an army, but this is your, like, assassination and scouting type hero, or is the best suited for that out of all of them. So yeah, the idea is pin them down, get some charges with your cavalry, get some damage in with the infantry. Well, yeah, and I was going to say, you might even want to consider replacing the Wild Riders with Zotes, which obviously we're going to see in the next one. The reason for that being that Zotes are anti-large, right? Yeah, we do that with this last one. Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. This is a little bit more of like your standard expectation, and you wouldn't. I don't think you'd have Blade Singers with the DLC, but you would be able to do the what are they called? War Dancers, right? So this would be one that you can do without needing the DLC. You can still get Treekin, Wild Riders, Rangers, and then War Dancers, right? So that's your like melee infantry, cavalry, and forest spirit army composition. Okay, the next one I want to look at, I've already spoiled these a little bit here, but Treekin, Zotes, and Archers, plus all heroes, right? So if we're looking at what we have here, right? Treekin and Zotes off the same tree, Archers, and then we would probably have to get the Azray Forge, so that's 3 buildings. But then you can take the 4th building here for a hero, and you could even take the 5th building here, like that spare building that we would have, right? That can just be used to take this hero. We don't have to choose between 2 heroes because we're using the Forest Spirits building for our army production as well, right? Again, Treekin, because they're a defensive unit, they're used to bog the enemy down. Once they're all clumped up, you've got plenty of great targets for your archers to be shooting at. You also have the Zotes to be able to charge in, right? So these kind of replace the cavalry. Instead of getting the cavalry building, if you have the DLC and you can bring Zotes into the fight, like these are your cavalry, right? And they even have some, like the Sisters of Thorn, they even have a couple of special like magic spells that they bring into the battle as abilities, right? So you've got the Treekin for holding the line, you've got the Zotes for cycle charging and dealing damage, and then your archers can kind of stay clear of the fight and do damage the whole time, plus you have all your heroes, okay? The other option is Treekin, Zotes, and melee infantry, right? Same concept. You have the Treekin pin everything down. The Zotes function as your cavalry. They can do cycle charging, and then the melee infantry is going to gang up on all of the stuff that's tar pitted by the Treekin. So you can kind of have the Zotes navigate. You can have them focus down anti-large targets because you don't really have anti-large options with anything else here, right? You can have them focus down the enemy backline. Instead of trying to chase them with your Treekin and your melee infantry, you have Zotes that can run and mess up their archer backlines, right? Or go with their cavalry. Otherwise, if they're going melee heavy, you just have the Zotes for charging, right? So it's a pretty versatile unit. Again, I know this is pretty similar to the cavalry one. I definitely think these are a little bit different function, and frankly, this is probably better just because with this army you don't have an anti-large option. But again, it depends on what kind of tree, like what, military trees you're trying to pursue, what kind of endgame units you're looking at, right? If we're talking like Zotes versus Great Stag Knights, I mean, we still need to see that cavalry charge bug get fixed, but obviously Great Stag Knights are going to be like your better damage dealing. Like that stat line's just ridiculous, right? So it depends on what you're going for and what your goals are, not just for the early game and mid game, but also into the late game. With that being said, that covers all of our mid game armies. So let's go ahead and take a look at the late game armies now. Alright, so here we have some late game armies. At this stage, if we're talking about late game stage of the campaign and the kind of armies that you would have, I'm assuming by now you have more than one elven province, right? In the mid-game armies, I talk about trying to function off of one province and assuming that at tier 4 you'd have 8 buildings. Obviously, I'd expect you to have another province or 2 set up by that time, but they're not likely to be at tier 4 by the time you're in mid-game. However, when you're hitting late game, you still might not have a second one at tier 5, but you should have a good variety of options. But really, we're talking about late game compositions in terms of what am I going to be building for the rest of the game, right? So I'm throwing building limitations out the window at this point, obviously. So the first army we're going to look at hasn't changed, right? Waywatcher Doomstack, right? At this point, you should just be able to field more armies like this and throw more of them around. They're still going to have the same strengths and the same weaknesses they did previously. I feel like this will lose a little bit of effectiveness in the late game, especially if you're going up against like artillery heavy factions. Like this is going to perform great against melee focused factions. It's going to perform poorly against artillery. But other than that, it's still very solid, viable, and very easy to manage stack, right? You don't have to worry as much about the units. You can focus on your hero micro. Second army, again, trying to stick to the classics here. We've got a little bit of spearmen, archer, cavalry, but instead of spearmen, we have treemen, right? In the late game, at this stage of the campaign, I don't really think you can or should try to justify using spearmen, like the shielded spearmen. The weakness of the treemen is that they're going to take a lot of damage from missile attacks. They do have high armor and missile resistance, but they're obviously not going to take quite as much damage from artillery. They should be more survivable. By this point, you should be able to get some different kinds of mages. I don't have healing. Well, I do have healing magics here because I have a branch wraith, and it's pretty low level, but regardless of that, you can use healing magics to offset the weaknesses of the treemen. You don't really have anything that can offset the weakness, like the vulnerability of your spearmen to artillery fire. Anyway, with this composition, your treemen are the new holding units, right? You use the treemen to kind of pin things in place. You're going to have to use your heroes to assist if you compose it like this, because I've left it a little light on frontliners. But then you still have, I put a couple Sisters of Thorn in here. If you have cavalry at the high level, you should have a couple of these. They still have a good stat line. They still have good bonuses. Great support unit. I think 2 is fine, right? A good supply of archers. You could maybe even cut some of these archers, cut 2 archers for 2 like treemen to be able to hold if you're having trouble holding the lines properly, right? But otherwise, just having some high tier archers to do a lot of damage and be a little bit mobile, it's going to be useful. And then of course the great stag knights, just absolutely insane stat line. They're very strong. There is the cavalry bug right now where when you charge, all the damage is calculated instantly or something along those lines. So you might struggle with these a little bit, but that's the idea behind this army, right? Pin them in place with your treemen to start, get damage on the flankers with your archers, and then flank and smash yourself with the great stag knights. Okay. The next one I want to look at is going to be a little bit different here. We've got treemen, dragons, and archers, right? So again, treemen are there for the same purpose, pin things in place. We've got a few more of them here to hold things in place better. Your forest dragon, these are a great like late game versatile unit, right? They're flying, and so they do have some of the weaknesses of flying units. I mean, they still have good health, but they have less health than the treemen by a decent margin. They have less armor. They are, of course, faster, though, right? They have the breath attacks. So the idea here is you use the treemen to clump everything up. You annihilate any clumps with the forest dragon's breath attack. You then can use the forest dragon's high speed and charge bonus to either get into their back lines and snipe heroes, or just push away their archers, right, and give your treemen time to fight. And then, of course, with everything clumped up around your treemen, your archers are going to do excellent damage to them as well. The next composition we have here is, again, our melee-focused composition, right? We have the treemen here to replace the treekin to pin things in place, but this pretty much looks like one of the ones we saw in the mid-game, right? Treemen are there to pin things in place, a somewhat defensive unit to hold the line. You've got Zotes for your anti-large option, and essentially functioning as cavalry to get charging. And then you have a variety of infantry that you like, so you get everything clumped up on the treemen. You can have your infantry surround them and decimate them with high damage, and then you have the Zotes for multi-purpose targeting, whether that's anti-large or just rear charges on the infantry or archer scattering, right? The next one you have here, this one I'm not too sure how I feel about it, but it's definitely an option. I don't think it's just, I know that it's not an option that I'm super comfortable with, so I don't use this kind of army a lot. But we're in the end game, right? Like, these are 3 tier 5 units and a tier 4 unit, right? Again, same concept. Treemen, pin things in place. Forest dragons, fire breath, high damage, great hero sniping, and can like, or just like flanker, right? But then you even have the cavalry, right? And you have 2 types of cavalry. So you have the great stag knights, ridiculous damage, armor piercing, very fast, and then you still have the Zotes, because you still don't, you can kind of use the forest dragons for sniping like single entities, but the Zotes having the actual anti-large bonus will really help with that, right? So you have kind of like multi-purpose flying unit, multi-purpose line holder, you have then anti-large, and essentially like, I guess, anti-infantry on the great stag knights. I know they're not specific. Well, are they? No, bonus versus large on the Great Stag Knights as well. Well, there you have it. Obviously, this army is going to be expensive, but it's going to be very strong. It's going to smash a lot of things to pieces. The last army I'm going to bring up here, maybe one of the more obvious ones, Treeman Doomstack, right? You're at tier 5, you're playing as the Wood Elves. If you've seen Legend of Total War's charity stream as Durthu, you know what this is all about, right? I don't even know if you need this Life Mage in there, because you do technically get healing spells on this Ancient Tree Man, right? So you don't even necessarily need this Life Mage or anything else in here. You can just have one Tree Man with the heals and 19 Tree Men, and you just clump them all up together and you just batter down anything that's in your way. It's a strong unit, it's pretty versatile, and you can essentially just brute force whatever you want. So that is all the late game army suggestions that I have. I have a couple more ideas that I wanted to float, and you can tell Wood Elf economy makes it hard to set up a kind of guide like this, but I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend these as good compositions, but they could be fun compositions. Doing a cavalry and dragon stack, right? You have your Great Stag Knights and maybe some Zotes. They're going to be fast, they're going to be able to roam the map easily, and same thing with the dragons, right? If you just do cavalry and dragons, you have like a high-speed army. It's going to be kind of weak and suffer from engagements, but you can essentially run around the map until you get a favorable engagement. Another idea is just pure Treeman Archer, right? I mean, we've got some armies here with Treeman Archers and other stuff, but just pure Treeman to hold the line and then Archers to do the damage, right? If you get enough Treeman and enough Archers, that can definitely be an option. I think the dragons serve a great purpose in this army, but you could cut them and just replace it with 2 more Treemen and 2 more Archers. Otherwise, Treemen, Dragon, and Zotes, you go the full Forest Spirit build, kind of fill into that little bit role, and you don't necessarily have like really good anti-infantry at that time, but you have the Dragon Breath spell from the dragons, and it's just going to be such a strong army that you can deal a lot of damage. So, with that being said, I think that is the end of my Wood Elf army composition guide for a campaign with the DLC. I hope that you learned some valuable tips and tricks, some ideas about what kinds of varieties of army compositions, or how you can use the Wood Elf like economy and building methods to kind of to piece together the different parts of your army that you need in order to create a functioning army, and how to balance that with which buildings to build and how to keep your economy safe. I hope that you thought this video was fun and interesting. I really look forward to seeing any comments or suggestions you have in the description. As a matter of fact, I decided to do the Wood Elves next for my videos because one person commented on my last campaign army composition video that I should do the Wood Elves next. So here we are. Most likely my next series is going to be the Empire, because I've had that requested as well, so I'd like to work on those. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. Please leave any comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the videos. And with that being said, we'll see you on the next one.